Hey. So I should be streaming live now, back on, and on my, yeah, it says I'm live. So great. So thank you for those of you who have hung in there. Thank you so much for hanging in. So I want to show you this. This is the banner that we did for Ellen. So the website features all of the banners, which are part of an actual physical exhibit and opened at the City of Vancouver Archives. And we will bring it around Canada when things open back up. But for now, we decided to bring it online. So this is the banner for Ellen, and there's 17 different women that were featured in this, and one man, Christopher Moore, a trans man. And I wanted to start us off in our conversation with Ellen by just talking about the quote that, as at the top of the banner, she wrote, "We have to say the word lesbian until it doesn't mean anything anymore. And this is that is when we will truly be safe." So, welcome, Ellen. Thank you very much for joining us today. Can you tell us more about what you meant by that, and how you in the early days, how you got started committing yourself to saying that word over and over again, and what it meant to say that word, back in the 70s?
First of all, I want to thank you, Elise, for this amazing show, which is at the Vancouver Archives, and I'm hoping one day everyone will get to see it because it really is a breakthrough testament to the rising up of a lot of incredible women at a time when I came out, sort of 69, 70, women were being put in jail for being lesbian, gay, trans wasn't even talked about back then. Bisexual, two-spirited wasn't talked about then. We were being thrown in insane asylums. Many people were. Women were having their children taken from them. And when we organized the first, what we called the Gay Women's Conference in Toronto in 1972, women literally wore paper bags over their heads so they couldn't be identified, because they knew if they were identified, they would lose their children, be incarcerated, or be put in mental asylums, as they were called then. So it was an amazing time, because it was a time of the student movement. It was the beginnings of the women's movement and the right, and to get women's right to abortion and safe birth control. It was students were rising up to have courses that related to their daily lives. The Indochinese movement, the Black civil rights movement that really in North America kicked this whole thing off, and the beginning in Vancouver of the Red Power movement. So we were coming out of all those movements to build what was sometimes called the gay movement. But those of us who came out of the women's movement were fighting with the women's movement for the right to be openly lesbian, but we were fighting within the gay movement to be openly feminists, to be part of the women's liberation movement. Because the gay men who had, as I say, two gay men together have 60% more income than two women living together. So our issues were different. Our issues were around childcare, elder care, unpaid work, really low pay compared to men. We didn't own the bars. We didn't own the businesses. We didn't control the media. So we were fighting to try to say we have to use the word lesbian, because although we're homosexual, our lives are very, very different than gay men's. Just like trans people today are fighting fighting the gays, fighting the lesbians, fighting for their own cultural and physical space in our movement and in society generally.
Mm. And one of the ways that you did that was you were involved in the other woman, and I've just put up on the screen here, although I suspect you can't see it. Um, no, it's a copy of the front page of the fifth anniversary issue. And I just want to let people know that I found this on the Rise Up Feminist Archive, and at the bottom of the screen that everybody can see, there's a link to how you can download this issue yourself. And it's so amazing. Just looking at this one issue, in this one issue, there were articles on Palestinian women, on sex work, on lesbians, on credit unions, on talking about class in the women's movement. Like it's on Indigenous women. Like it's quite amazing in this one, in this, I think it's 1977, this copy. So tell us a little bit about how you were able to use this, the newspapers like the other women to talk about lesbian issues and to deal with homophobia within the movement.
A little backup. I was working in Georgia Strait in 1971 doing layout, and we were so frustrated with the Georgia Strait. Then, even more so than now, there were almost never women on the cover and very, very few articles about women. So we occupied the Georgia Strait and put out a women's issue. And then we did that again. And at the same time, I was fighting with the Pedestal, which was the women's liberation newspaper, to get a lesbian issue in the Pedestal. And was being told that lesbian was an American psychological import. It wasn't a political issue.
Oh,
so it was a very, it was a time of emergence and very frustrating and difficult. And I went back to Toronto for my brother's wedding, and I met Holly DeVore, who's now Erin DeVore, and she was working as a photographer at the Guerrilla newspaper, similar to the Georgia Strait. And I talked to her about the idea of setting up a lesbian feminist newspaper. And I decided to move back to Toronto. We drew a group of women together around it, and we started The Other Women. And we very much saw ourselves as coming out of social movement. So right from the beginning, we talked about the Indigenous women's issues, about the Indo-Chinese Women's Conference. And we talked about our lives and not having, in Vancouver, we had the Vanport, which we could go to. In Toronto, there was it was called the Blue Door back then. But, the bars didn't want political people in their spaces. They were businesses, and they had to be pretty closeted as well. But we finally had this vehicle that we could talk about our lives. And then Judith Quinlan and I, we wrote this the centerfold. In those days, all the activist papers, we used our centerfolds to create posters that people could put up on their walls. And we did this article that called "On a Queer Day You Could See Forever." And we decided that we needed some way of getting out of Toronto to circulate our information wider. We bought an old school bus and painted it up and put curtains in it and called it Cora, the Women's Liberation Mobile, after Cora E. Hines, who was a very dykey-looking Alberta minister. And that was really those were our vehicles to talk about our lives, to talk about being activists and in solidarity with other liberation movements at home and around the world.
It's kind of cool, like to think about getting in a van like that and traveling from community to community. What are some of your favorite memories of doing that?
Well, it was a full school bus, it was this huge, huge school bus with these huge tires, and we stripped out all the chairs and we made the front part of the bus kind of a meeting area by turning the chairs sideways, and we had a wages for housework sign in the window. And then we put bookshelves in. We got old books from the Toronto Library, and got a little bit of an OFY grant, so we were able to paint the bus red and white. We had a children's area at the back, and then we slept in the bus, and we had Coleman stove, so sometimes we parked somewhere side of the road. And we traveled to small communities all over the place. And I remember one time in Sudbury, we were staying with a friend. We found this lesbian couple, and they were in the suburbs. We woke up in the morning, and they'd spray painted over our lettering Women's Liberation Bookmobile on the side with Hormobile's Bookmobile or something like that. So we realized we had to deal with it quickly because she was a single mother on welfare. And we had to not jeopardize her situation, because in those days there was no place to turn, and she could have lost her kids, lost her job in Sudbury. So we had to fix it up and get out on the road quickly out of that situation so that she was safe. And then one fun memory I have is just we're driving along the highway and there's a group of people hitchhiking. And I said, come on, let's pull over. And Lorna Boschman was in the bus with us that time, I think, and Boo Watson. Can't remember who else was on it. And these people, these young people, they were hippies. They thought they were in some kind of a movie or something. They couldn't figure out what have we just entered. Obviously, all these dykes and all this literature and everything. So it was. And we had the lesbian women, like there was our newspaper, the lesbian women, Lavender Jane Loves Women. There were very, very, very few. We did, we had the Boston Women's Health Collective, and then we would use books like Margaret Lawrence's books, or Phyllis Webb was a lesbian poet, the only one lesbian poet we knew about, except then Rita Mae Brown did her book of poetry. So there wasn't a lot of lesbian literature, but it was we were part of the women's liberation movement, and I had been part of the On to Auto abortion caravan. So I had real sense of the power of the women's movement, and that we had enough power to chain ourselves in the House of Commons, and we had to keep pushing forward. And it's rather like the times we're in right now. We know that life never goes in a straight line. As queers, we know that. We're lucky if we can find a pocket of air somewhere, and then we have to share it and widen it and broaden the movement. And we need solidarity with other people because we're a relatively small proportion of the population. So there was a moment, and we seized that moment.
I want to ask you about the abortion caravan, because in a future episode there's a book that's coming out about it, and it's so important to our history, not only for, of course, the political battle itself, but I think in terms of movement organizing, it's such a both exciting story, but also really important one. And I just want to. I always talk to my students about why do you think lesbians would have been involved in the issue around reproductive choice? It doesn't seem to be relevant. Just to get them to try and think about why those certain kinds of alliances were made. So how would you answer that? If I was going to ask you that question, why were lesbians involved in that at all?
I came out after we got home. After we driven across the country, spoken, went to Parliament Hill, and then just a small group of us chained ourselves in the House of Commons. I wasn't talking about being a lesbian then. And you have to remember, those were the 60s and 70s. It was a lot of free love. People were sleeping around all over the place. I think a number of us were having relationships with men and secretly having relationships with women in trying to find out who we were. And from that strength of seeing what a movement could do, seeing what a group of women could do together, we were able to come out. But during the caravan, I was not open, and I hadn't spoken to. These are sisters. These are people I'd worked closely with. I'd set up I was elected head of the Speakers Bureau at UBC, and so I used my office at the Student Union Building as the first women's center at UBC. But so I'd worked deeply with these women, closely, intimately. It was the student movement, whether it was the women's movement, but I never talked about being a lesbian at that time. And it sort of went between the activism in the student movement and solidarity with the Quebec Liberation Movement. And then at the end of the day, I'd go home and visit a couple of lesbians I knew, the only two lesbians I knew who had a relationship with each other, but they weren't talking about being lesbians. They were just living it. And going to the Vampart, people didn't talk about being lesbians at the Vampart. This was made in the Hastings, right? They were heavily drinking and being able to be, hug each other or perhaps occasionally kiss each other publicly in that one space. But it was still a very, very dangerous time for us to be out. It was the strength of the women's movement and the student movement and other liberation movements that gave us that notion that we were a movement. And with our movement, we could work with the gay activists towards equality, and have demonstrations and be out there. But we were seen as crazy, right? We were not. There was no place we didn't have places in Vancouver to meet aside from these bars. it was a very, but it was interesting. After Pierre Trudeau, the prime minister at the time, made his statement that the state has no right in the bedrooms of the people, it was 3 months after that statement and that Stonewall happened. And his statement went around the world. And I've always thought that his statement was like the match that lit the fire that exploded at Stonewall. And for so many things came out of that moment.
Yeah, that's interesting. So it's also interesting to think about. You ended up going into politics, and in 2002 you become the first out lesbian city councillor in all of Canada. So it's quite. I mean, that really I think says a lot about how long it took for it to be okay for someone to be out. And I would say it still isn't. Like, I'm sure it's still difficult, even though there are a lot more out people. It's still pretty hard to be out. But what I want to do is now segue to the present, because there's so much going on right now, and because of your, what the choices that you've made with what to do, you're still very, very involved with internationally what's happening politically. And when we were speaking before, I told you that I was trying to think about how to think queerly about this moment, like how do queer people matter, and queerness, how does it matter in this moment? And you shared with me this statement by Outright, and I'm just gonna put that up on the screen here. I did share it on the ALOT webpage, so if people want to have a look at this, and I really encourage them to have a look at it. The link is there on our Facebook page, and I'll try and add it to our YouTube page afterwards. I'm still learning how to use all of these technologies. But anyways, we have you here, so please tell us about Outright and how you and this statement advances those kinds of issues in this moment right now.
Well, I think there's an assumption in North America that, especially in Canada, where we fought successfully to gain a lot of rights. I mean, we have, rights to not be discriminated in job and housing, and to get married if we want to get married. We feel safe to approach our members of parliament or our premiers or our city councillors, mayors. And at Vancouver, we set up an LGBTQ2IS advisory committee, and we have a really good trans policy at the Parks Board. So there's many examples we have that make us feel safe. We don't have a lot of spaces to go to anymore, and we're feeling so safe, but we do have rights. But I was asked in 2016 by the Youth Hub of UN Habitat to hold a queer consultation to try to get some wording, and the UN Habitat, which is the body that deals with city issues, it only meets every 20 years, and between that, every 2 years is the World Urban Forum. So we wrote a queer declaration, and we worked with the Canadian government to try to get wording in the final document, which is the guideline for cities for 20 years, to get wording in. And I was also working online with an international coalition of women's organizations, and we did get some wording in around intersectionality into the document, but we couldn't get any wording into the final document about LGBTQ I2S. So the Canadian government called me up and said, would you be willing to help us organize a panel at the conference, but just probably it's going to be in the hallway, some way we do this. So I said, yes, we've got to do it. So we were able to get the Minister of Housing for the United States, Julian Castro, to speak, the Mayor of LA to speak, Mr. Duclos, that was the federal minister at the time dealing with these issues, and two queer activists I'd met while we were in Quito. So that happened. And then at the following World Urban Forum, which was held 2 years later, I was able to speak at the Youth Habitat, and we pushed it further. And then finally, this past September, I was asked to go to Abu Dhabi in the United Arab Emirates, where it's punishable by death to be homosexual, to speak at the World Urban Forum, the 10th World Urban Forum. And to talk about our issues there. So there's such a range of laws and rights for our community around the world. But in a time like a pandemic like this, where there's been this phenomenal collapse of economies around the world, we are isolated. We're being forced back into our homes, which is, often there's a lot of domestic violence happening for women and queers. We're losing our jobs. We're losing our small businesses. Employees are losing their jobs. We're getting really sick without the human rights protections. Refugees who thought they could come to Canada can't get into Canada. They can't get across borders, and the disease is spreading in the camps, the refugee camps, and we have yet to set up secure and safe laws around the world. So the statement by Outright is so good. It really details the situation we're in around the world and why we must build our movements urgently at this time and to work with other social movements to fight on these issues, because we could see our rights turned around so quickly. If we're watching what's happening in the United States, so many of our rights are being overridden by, really, I have to, I think that Noam Chomsky is talking about the rise of fascism in the United States. And we know what that's going to mean, because those of us who are elders have lived it. And we know that we could go backwards so quickly. And as long as Trudeau is in power, he is an outspoken leader on queer issues in Canada and around the world. But there are very, very, very few people like him. And we need to support Rainbow, Refugee, and other groups who are working internationally. But we also have to work with our unions. We have to work with Feminists Deliver. We have to work with the Transit Coalition that's forming now, because cities are going bankrupt. TransLink's going bankrupt. And the climate change movement is pointing out that the big fossil fuel companies, the oil and gas companies, have had 29 meetings with the federal government over a 2-week period. And the feds are talking about giving them $1.5 billion, which is, if we had that $1.5 billion put into good green jobs, instead of digging holes for a dying industry that's polluting it, or to put in long-term healthcare infrastructure and affordable housing programs nationally, we would really not go back to the old normal, which wasn't good enough, but we could create a new world. And we urgently need to be part of those fights to get the kind of world that really does include us. And by being part of the fights, we create that new world.
Yeah, I think, I agree with you completely. I've been doing work here on my university campus, which is Simon Fraser University, around equity for a few years. And I've been feeling like smart, I've never been a political strategist. I've always been a participator. I show up at marches, but I've not thought strategically. And now that I'm doing this work, I've been coming to appreciate how difficult this work is and how incremental it is. And I've also been thinking that, we need to get in now with the administration and be talking about and building relationships of trust, having a seat at the table, and getting that seat at the table is so hard. And as you say, 29 meetings in 2 weeks, like when you think of all the things that need to be addressed, that they're taking up that much airspace, that much of our government's time. It's really
our money, taxpayers' money.
Yeah. Totally.
Running a bailout with our money, and we have to say no. We want that money for good green jobs. We want it for, a national housing strategy, for a good health care, because the pandemic is not over and could flare up again. We don't need them. They could use the Bank of Canada. They are the sole stakeholder, the Bank of Canada. The Bank of Canada has already bought up 2 provinces' provincial debts. That's its role. It could easily be providing us with a good public transit system, instead of TransLink talking about gutting 30 to 50% of our buses in our public transit system, which will really hurt people, the lowest income people the most, women and families, children, immigrants, low income people. We need to stand solidly together with the unions are fighting it, with the Indigenous communities are calling out, because there's no funding for the BC Association of Indian Friendship Centers, and they're a place where Indigenous people in cities can go and get support, and they don't have any money. And there's very little money going to the reserves. I think $41 million went to the reserves across Canada, which is a drop in the bucket for the crisis they're facing in isolation with very few health supports. But we're all in these different silos, the queer movement, the women's movement, the Indigenous movement, the labor movement. We need to be working together with one voice, speaking cross-sectorally against racism, against the isolation of Indigenous people in the North, against the isolation of the LGBTQI2S community, support for the women's movement. We need that gendered intersectional lens rooted in social justice that Crenshaw talks about. This is the time we need it. We need to overcome those differences, respectfully put in place a movement and use the statement that Outright has done. And there's also Feminist Alliance has done a very good statement. And we need to be lobbying our federal ministers. We need to be talking to them now. We need to put the pressure on. They know there's an election coming, and it could be coming within a year of this initial stage of this crisis. And we need them to hear us right now that we need their support for good public social infrastructure and not a bailout of the big fossil fuel industry. Yeah. This is our interest.
So, I agree with you. I'm sure I suspect many people tuning in do too. So since the purpose of this gathering is to sort of reflect on the past, can you say, you talked about intersectionality, which comes out of the women's movement for sure. And, Mary Wu Sims, who's also going to be a future guest, she was Human Rights Commissioner, a woman of color, and she, that's been her practice, right? Her whole life. I mean, she lives that reality. So we'll get a chance to talk to her too.
It comes out of the Black women's movement. It comes out of the Black women's movement.
Yeah. The intersectionality, but intersectionality as a practice is something I think a lot of people have been living, right, for a long time. In addition to intersectionality, are there a couple other, can you maybe give us two more lessons when you think about, okay, what you're saying to us, Ellen, is, if you look at Outright and see how we can think about the future and be strategic now. So what can you give us maybe two more lessons you've learned from that here, the 70s and 80s, the kind of organizing, what kind of lessons can we learn from the past to bring forward for this moment? Can you give us a couple more?
Well, I think there's an urgent need for coalition building, and we can do it on Zoom. I mean, Naomi Klein and Angela Davis were on not long ago. You can look at their YouTube. There's been a lot of there's now a transit coalition in the Lower Mainland forming, and Mayor Jonathan Cote was on a YouTube talking about that just 2 days ago that I was in on. You need to talk to your friends. You need to use your organizations. You need to ask your leadership of your organizations to meet with other leaders, have webinars within our sectors to talk about what our issues, so we're clear what our issues are. I like to use the FIST, here's 5 coalitions: the women's movement, the queer movement, the Indigenous movement, the workers movement, the anti-poverty movement. We don't lose our identities, but when we come together in a fist, we're that much stronger. And that's what we need at this time, to be clear on what our issues are, but clear that we need a coalition if we're going to be strong enough to stop the big business that's just already lobbying massively the federal government to take our money for the social programs we need and the future we want for their own dying industry. But it's going to take us being in those coalitions to stop them.
Yeah, and to go back to that issue of that one issue of the other woman that I looked at, like you could really see, back in the 70s, I mean, a lot of younger people think that in the 70s, feminists were very, one-track minded, but you can really see, especially, I think it may be particularly true in Canada, because socialist feminism was so strong, so powerful here, that you really see women grappling with all of those issues. I want to invite people who have tuned in, and we have 14 people tuning in right now. So hi to everybody out there. Thank you so much for joining us. We're so happy to have you here with us on this in Vancouver, where Ellen and I are right now. It's like the first day of summer. It's just so beautiful out there. So thank you for for tuning in. If anybody had any questions or any of their own memories that they wanted to share, please make a comment. I can see both the comments in both Facebook and on YouTube, so feel free to do that. Um, and while people are thinking about possibly posing a question, Ellen, you are also part of a writing collective called Quirky, which has been going for many years here in Vancouver. And it's published several collections of its writing. And there's a brand new collection that's out, and you have a piece in there. And I thought that would be a really great way. Yeah, there it is. Together We Stand, hot off the press. Get your copy now. Yeah, and I'd like to end today with the piece that you shared in that collection.
Thank you, Elise. I think it's really important my other point is that we are not alone, and we must reach out to each other and we must reach out globally. So this is called You Have Struck a Rock. You have struck a rock. We will fight back. We're seniors, and we have seen the likes of you before. We will fight back. We are the rock that is there beneath the surface. We're the mountain that is full of memories of resistance, hell, terror, fear, and rage. We're a mountain full of joy, experience, camaraderie, and passion. You have struck a rock. The mountain has begun to move. We're shaking off our contentment, our patience, and our joy in the lives we have built. You will see us rise up. There are millions of us. We have no fear. We have nothing left but to fight. You see, we're LGBTQI2S seniors. Spell it out. We're lesbians who have emerged out of the women's liberation movement. We're gay men who have emerged out of the AIDS movement. We are the trans creating new movements. We're queers who have come out of the Black, Latino, and Asian movements. We're the Two-Spirit who have been honored by indigenous cultures around the world for thousands of years. We're queers who are silenced for lifetimes, beaten up, tortured, incarcerated, and murdered. We are everywhere. We're the ones who created the laws that you are tearing up. We're the ones whose lives are at stake. We know that life never goes in a straight line. We're angry. We remember the past. Our time is short. We're coming out of our homes to join the millions of others whose lives you think you can destroy. Together, we are rising up.
Wow, that's just it's great. It's great. And I'm so pleased that you are rising up, and I'm so pleased to have such wonderful relationships with so many people in the community, people like yourself who are doing the amazing work that you do. And I'm also very happy to be able to share this wealth with everybody else out there. So I really want to thank you, Ellen, not just for coming here today, but for everything that you do and for continuing to fight and being so positive and optimistic and unrelenting and passion and in your passion. And I have to also say, being so always willing to work with my students. You've given so many interviews, so you never tire of sharing your story, and it means so much because we need those stories. I mean, we always need them, but we especially need them right now. So my thanks to you, Ellen.
This is coalition building. Yeah. What we're doing right now, we're building those networks and that strength that comes out of our fights and our losses and sharing our stories and figuring out how to move forward together. So thank you. It's a pleasure.
Yeah. All right. Well, thank you everybody out there for tuning in today. I hope you will go check out all of the banners that are part of the exhibit on the Allot webpage, which you can find here. I have the web address. There you go, down there. Thank you, Susan, for your very kind comment. And yeah, thank you everybody for joining in. Have a wonderful week. And next week we'll be joined by Esther Shannon, who I know you will all really enjoy my conversation with her. Esther Shannon, originally from Nova Scotia, Cape Breton, I think. Yeah, so I'm really looking forward to talking to her and looking forward to seeing all of you next week. Okay, bye.
Bye.